So I thought making this video would be a straightforward process with clear results, but it hasn't been one at all. But what we all know by now is that the Bantu didn't come out of West Africa. Heck, most West Africans can't correctly pronounce the expression Bantu. They usually say Bantu. So how can this be an expression from their languages if they can't even say it correctly? It's not. And the Bantu migration theory is very wrong, and we the Proto-Bantu know that, and we are now telling you, none of that ever happened. But this also means that our ancestors' haplogroups should be different from the E1B1A West African subclade and easily identifiable. But the outcome isn't so straightforward, because it turns out that genetic trees are constantly being readjusted and rearranged to fit current incorrect conventional narratives. One such narrative is the Bantu migration. They're constantly rearranging these genetic trees to fit the West African origin story about the Bantu. This means that genes found amongst Bantu populations that deviate from the E1B1A paternal and L1 or L2 maternal haplogroups, which they are pushing to be Bantu, are repositioned and forced to fit into these subclades where they don't belong, just so they can fit the narrative that all Bantu identifying people come from West Africa. And respectfully, we don't. Not the Proto-Bantu or their descendants. Respectfully, we aren't of West African origin or Central Proto-Sudanic origin. That is not our history. We have our own, and this force-fitting exercise is not only harmful. I did a 23andMe genetic test about 3 years ago, which showed that my maternal haplogroup is L3, specifically L3E. L3, to my understanding, is the Proto-Bantu mtDNA branch. This branch was dominant in southeastern Africa, the same way L0 was the original dominant Sun mtDNA, L1 the original dominant Nilotic mtDNA, and L2 the original dominant and still is West African mtDNA. But I noticed there's this shift to align L3 with the Nilotic and Kushite populations. I am not Nilotic, nor am I Kushite. The Kushites are in fact younger than the Proto-Bantu and were connected to Rasha or Kush. Rasha is the Proto-Bantu expression with the vowels, and they were most likely a Proto-Bantu related civilization before the raids and invasions that changed their linguistics and phenotype. But because of the limited genetic data and comprehension of African history, many populations are left out just because they have smaller numbers, and this is a weakness of Western academia, which tends to allot importance to numbers without context. Therefore, when a population has lower numbers, Western academia deems them not important, when oftentimes they are the foundation, especially if versions of their language and or cultural practices are found amongst larger populations. This says something happened and is likely the reason their numbers dwindled. And this is why I always say context is very important when studying African history. According to 23andMe, my ethnic groups don't exist, so the best they could do was misclassify my results as belonging to the populations that have some of my genetics. And in my case, these were the ones that raided, invaded, looted, abducted, and alived my ancestors, which was frankly beyond offensive. But my experience is not unique. The Tonga of Mozambique were invaded by Shangaan. Today, they're called the Shangaan Tonga. The San, who were invaded by the Swana and the Dutch, experienced the same erasure. The Himanansa, who were invaded by Mzlikazi and his Ndebele horde, are also identified with their destroyers. which is why we have to be linguistically and culturally fluent when explaining African history. Everybody is still here, ugly histories and all, we're all still here. So in order to determine the Proto-Bantu haplogroups, I looked into my own ethnic group, the BaTonga, and the closely related populations, because we are not many anymore, and those who speak a close dialect are related to us, and we come from the same place, so it made sense for me to do this way. And these are the Subiya and the Hue. The Hue are often misclassified and they mispronounce this word as Hue, but it's actually Hue. Now, the study I found doesn't state where these samples were taken, and this is very important when studying African history so that we can know the ancestry of the people. Because even if people may identify as the same group and language and may speak the same language, they may not share ancestral history because of integration, which happened voluntarily when refuge was sought or forcefully when they were invaded. For example, among the BaTonga, there was an influx of Shona refuge-seeking people into what we call the valley at different points in time when there were gaps in leadership, and as a result, the genetics of the valley would not be a true reflection of the BaTonga. But this study is so far the only study that I could find, and it's the best we can get right now. The study showed the presence of EU175, EU174, EM2, and B112 within the Subiya, BaTonga, and Hue populations, which also showed high levels of haplodiversity going back to the influx of people in their territories. EU175 was present at 45% amongst the BaTonga, 73% amongst the Subiya and the Hue. EU174 was present at 37% amongst the BaTonga, 19% amongst the Hue, and 18% amongst the Subiya. And when we contextualize this is likely because there was a lot of murder, and many of their men died in those wars and invasions and raids, so there weren't many of them left. But here's where it gets muddy. Some sources say EU175 is a subclade of the E1B1B Y-Haplogroup, which is the Northeast African subclade, and others say it is a subclade of the E1B1A, which is the West African subclade. This confusion in categorizing these subclades stems from their presence in the so-called sub-Saharan populations. Apparently, we're all supposed to have EM2 fathers, or they will force it on us, damn it. Now here's where it gets interesting. I wanted to know whether this EU175 subclade is found in any other populations, and it turns out that it is, in the Tuareg. I was surprised. So how did this happen? The BaTonga are a Southern African population and the Tuareg are in the north. Conventional history says they've never had contact, but of course it also pushes the enslavement of the sub-Saharan narrative, that the Tuareg may have enslaved people from this region, because that is always the default narrative when it comes to explaining African history and reducing all Africans below the Sahara to nothing. Even though, without the Zanji sailing knowledge, the Europeans would not have successfully navigated the seas, or that the Portuguese would have never survived malaria in the interior without the Jaga. But this was obviously a surprise for me. At present, I don't know much about the Tuareg, except that they practice Islam, which we don't. And we really don't. And so, there are only two things I know about them right now. That they value the color blue, which they associate with divinity, and they are matrilineal. The Proto-Bantu also value the color blue, which is associated with the pharaonic house. and we are matrilineal. So how did they adopt these customs, and why are they so similar to the Proto-Bantu who predate the Tuareg? Without context, I can't say anymore, since I don't know much about the Tuareg people or their history. I would do more research and make videos about it, but I have linked the studies in the description box below. I don't like using genetics without context to explain human stories, especially African human stories, because they are layered and require sensitivity. What conventional history doesn't account for are the raids, invasions, and the infamous practice of abducting children between the ages of approximately 7 and 16 years old, as one major reason the genetics are so messed up. The boys were militarized, forced to plunder, cannibalize, and murder in order to earn their place. The girls were forced into domestic labor, concubinage, and in some instances militarized too, depending on the Jaga Gala column that abducted them. This is the reason African genetics are set up the way they are. It is also one reason the Maasai carry a higher frequency of the E1B1B, a Northeast African haplogroup, instead of the Zanji E1B1A, which is their founding haplogroup, whose practices they follow, or the Somalis. Therefore, what we see in modern African genetic data analysis are haplogroups in the wrong populations, and not their population of origin or their founding population. This is because of the abduction of children, and they were put into populations and raised with the values of that population, and I will make a video about this soon. So, as of now, the Proto-Bantu haplogroup hasn't been properly defined, so we can't say for certain which one it is until we get more data. But we know it isn't E1B1A. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. Please share, and if you liked this video enough to show your support, our Ko-fi link is in the description box below. Sources are also in the description.